All right, class, welcome. Module 11 is titled Uncivil Wars. This is module 11 out of 13, so we're getting pretty close. So President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, is the president after the assassination of President Kennedy. He was then elected in his own right in 1964, and he implemented what was referred to as the Great Society. Lots of parallels with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression. Um, Long story short, big uh, spending programs, mostly on social programs having to do with health, education, um, several other kind of components that we'll cover briefly. And, Johnson idolized Roosevelt. He was, a Democrat in the same political lane as Franklin Roosevelt was. And he wanted, big uh, government social welfare programs. And, for better or for worse, that may yield good results for vulnerable people in this country, which we want, of course. Uh, but, you know, since nothing is free in life, this is going to mean higher taxes, higher levels of spending in general. One interesting difference between the New Deal and the Great Society is that the New Deal was packaged as a response to an emergency, and that emergency, of course, was the Great Depression. So whatever you think about the virtue of the New Deal, it was, critics and supporters of the New Deal understand and agree that it was a political response to an emergency, to the Great Depression. Okay. An interesting difference between the New Deal and the Great Society is that when the Great Society was introduced in the mid 60s, the economy was doing great. There was no emergency. There was no depression. So it wasn't really a response to anything bad. It was just, a political movement to expand the scope of the federal government. So what did it include? Unprecedented spending on federal spending on all levels of education. So traditionally, education had been dealt with locally by cities and towns, or maybe at the state level. But this was federal spending on education at all levels. So it started, for example, the Head Start program, if you're familiar with that, federal funding for pre-K, all the way through elementary, middle school, high school, right? Federal funding to local school districts, federal funding for colleges and universities, the beginning of the modern financial aid uh, programs in terms of grants and loans for people to be able to afford college. So the whole range of education spending. Uh, it included several programs that all fall under the umbrella of what was called the War on Poverty. We'll go over some data on that in a minute. Medicare and Medicaid, those are the biggest social welfare programs in our history, uh, along with Social Security. And this was aimed at providing health insurance through taxpayer dollars to poor and or old people. So great intention, obviously, but wildly expensive. So if we look today at our spending, what does our federal government spend our tax dollars on? The two biggest outlays of federal money, of taxpayer money, by far, it's not even close. The two most expensive things that we do as a government are Social Security and Medicare slash Medicaid. That's about half of all of our spending. Arts, humanities, and public broadcasting. So this ushered in PBS, NPR, right? Public TV, public radio. Look, arts and humanities are great. The question is not, do we like art? The question is, should the federal government be spending taxpayer money to make art? That's kind of the philosophical question there. So we'll go through a couple examples, specifically the war on poverty. This is a great example of something that's in the eye of the beholder, where two people can look at the same set of data and come to kind of different conclusions based on their political worldviews. So poverty rates during the 1960s plummeted. They were cut in half. Fantastic. Awesome. That's objectively good. Poverty rate cut in half over the course of a single decade. Fantastic. The question is, and we all want that, right? Liberal, conservative, everyone wants lower poverty rates. Okay. The question is not, do we want to lower poverty rates? Yes, we do. The question is, how do we do that? And when we see poverty going down, which it did in the 1960s, the question is, okay, what caused that? Because whatever caused that, we want to identify that so that we can continue doing that, right? Because this is a good result. The question is like, how did this happen? And this is where there's a disagreement based on politics. So the book points out conservatives gave more credit for these changes, i.e., poverty rate plummeting. That's the change they're referring to. Conservatives said poverty rates plummeted due to the booming economy rather than government programs. And the liberals who support these big government spending programs, they say, oh, no, 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 no. Poverty rates fell because of our new social welfare programs. The poverty rates fell because of the war on poverty, because we spent all this taxpayer money. So I want to point out, and it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, but I want to point out one thing for you to consider that might help you figure out for yourself what caused poverty rate to plummet. Was it the fact that there was a great economy because of private businesses, or was it because of government spending, or maybe both? Poverty rates plummet. You can see starting in 1960 to 1970, they plummet. Fantastic. Why? Was it because of the war on poverty, big social welfare programs, spending tax dollars? Could be. I want to draw your attention to the fact that, so if you look at this chart, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but go down to the x-axis on the bottom with the dates, 1960 to 1970. Look at the y-axis, poverty rate starts plummeting in 1960. The war on poverty went into effect starting in 1965. What do you notice? What was happening to the poverty rate before the war on poverty? What was happening to the poverty rate between 1960 and 1965? The poverty rate was plummeting before the war on poverty even existed. Do you see that? So conservatives will say, well, look at this data right here. If the war on poverty caused the poverty rate to plummet, which is what liberals would argue, a conservative would say, okay, explain to me why poverty was dropping off a cliff before the war on poverty even started. The war on poverty did not cause poverty to go down between 1960 and 65 because the war on poverty didn't exist yet. So conservatives will say, look, this is evidence that the poverty was going down, not because of the war on poverty. War on poverty wasn't a thing. Poverty rate was going down because we had a great economy because of private businesses. Now, liberals will say, well, it was going down and that's cool, but the war on poverty, after the war on poverty was initiated in the mid to late 60s, the poverty rate fell even further. And that's true as well. You see that? So conservatives are saying, look, the war on poverty, whatever, poverty was already going down. It wasn't necessary. But liberals say, no, no, it was necessary because once we started the war on poverty, poverty fell even more. And they're both right. It's just a matter of your perspective, your point of view. The lowest poverty rates in American history were reached in 2019. The lowest poverty rates in American history. So once again, when we see a good result like that we should all be in favor of, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get to that result? Now, during 2019, there was no big, new, huge social welfare spending program instituted by the Trump administration at the time. There was no new war on poverty from the government. There was there were other economic policies in the first Trump administration that resulted in the lowest poverty rates in American history. If you're surprised by that, the fact that, because this is in your lifetime, this is, a handful of years ago, the lowest poverty rates in American history right before COVID hit. Is that news to you? It might be news to you. That might surprise you, right? And if it does, if you didn't know that, you're like, wow, why didn't I know that? Well, it says something about the nature of our news media, because if the president at the time were anyone else, you would know this. Okay. So the question is not, do you like the president? Do you like that president? The question is, hopefully we can all agree that the lowest poverty rates ever is good. So then the question is, all right, let's forget about the personalities involved. Let's look at the policy and find out how we got there, because we want to keep that going, right? So poverty rates during the 60s were cut in half. Awesome. The debate, though, is what was responsible for that? Was it the private sector creating jobs, or was it the government spending tax dollars on social programs, or maybe a mix of both? The Equal Pay Act, 1963, established the principle of equal pay for equal work. It made it illegal to pay people differently for the same work based on gender. Now, to this day, if you want to do a current event on this, to this day, there is what's referred to as the gender pay gap. There is a difference on average, okay? Obviously, there's millions of exceptions to this rule, but on average, the gap is going down. So this is from 2016 and it's 80%. Now so that's a 20% gap. Now the gap is lower. I believe it's about 16%. So it's shrinking, but it still exists. Okay. It's persistent. What is the gender pay gap? Let's just look at this 80% number. This is saying that as of 2016, over the course of an American's entire life, on average, women earn 80% as much money as men. On average, over the course of a lifetime. How do we explain that? Is it because it is legal to pay men 20% more to do the exact same job as a woman? No, that is not legal, and it hasn't been for 60 years. If it were legal to pay women less than men for the exact same job, you would not see any men working at, Walmart, for example. If I'm running a business and I can legally pay women less to do the exact same job, why would I hire men? Right? So common sense will tell you it's not that simple. There's something else going on here. Here's what leads to this gender pay gap in theory. Okay. Number one, women over the course of their lifetime tend to take more time off from work than men. And when you take time off from work, you don't get paid. Okay. Why do women in general tend to take more time off over the course of their career than men? Well, because women have babies. And very often, when women have babies, they take time off from work when the babies are newborns and infants. That's a pretty common thing. And when they do that, they're not earning money. Now, should we have, you want to talk about social welfare programs, should we have paid maternity leave in this country? Should we have a government, taxpayer funded program that says anytime an American woman gives birth, she will be paid 100% of her salary, whatever that might be, for 6 months? Hey, I have three young kids. That'd be awesome if that were a thing, but it's not. Maybe it should be. So that accounts for some of it, right? Women take time off when they have kids. The bigger contributor, though, is that women tend to gravitate towards different careers than men in general. Okay? And different jobs pay differently. There's an old saying that women like people and men like stuff. Women tend to gravitate towards certain types of careers in general, and men gravitate towards different types of careers. So, for example, I just told you I have three young children. My youngest is still in preschool. I've sent all my children to preschool. You know what I've never seen in any preschool that any of my children have ever gone to? A man working there. Early childhood education is a field, for example, that is overwhelmingly dominated by women, right? Women, it turns out, are really good at taking care of little kids. Um, they gravitate towards that field. And early childhood education doesn't pay all that much, right? Now, if you were to go to an offshore oil rig, you know what you would see very, very, very few of? Women working on the offshore oil rig. That is a field, for example, that is overwhelmingly dominated statistically by men. Who makes more? Someone working on an offshore oil rig or a teacher at a nursery school? You know the answer to that. So there's going to be a pay gap there, right? Now, the question then becomes, why are certain fields dominated by men or women? What is that about? Is there something in society that, for example, is discouraging women from pursuing high-paying jobs in STEM, let's say? And if there is, we need to fix that, right? That's a problem. But generally speaking, if people tend to gravitate towards different types of work, and those different types of work pay differently, is that a corrupt issue that we need to solve, or is that kind of just natural? Look, my best friend is a financial advisor. He is wealthy. I am a history teacher. I will never be wealthy. It has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with different jobs pay differently. I want to add one more complicating factor to this, if you want to look into this for a current event. Defining equal work is harder than it sounds. Let me give you an example. The NBA and the WNBA. I had a student look this up for me last year. I don't remember the exact number, but the minimum wage in the NBA, I believe, is about $1 million a year. And in the WNBA, it's like 50,000 a year or something. NBA players make exponentially more money than WNBA players. You know that, I think. Is that the same work? They're all playing basketball. And if you could argue in court that NBA and WNBA players are performing the same job, it would be illegal to pay them differently. So even defining what equal work is a little more complex. But here's the good news on the gender pay gap. It's not because it's legal to pay people different amounts based on their gender. That's not legal. And number two, the differential, the gap is shrinking. That's good. And it will continue to shrink based on many factors, one of which is that right now the majority of students at colleges and universities in this country are women. And so in the future, we can expect to see the gender pay gap shrinking. Uh, there's a lot more sociology stuff in this unit. After the baby boom, which we covered briefly, women were again having fewer children, aided now by the birth control pill. We talked earlier in the course in the era of urbanization about reasons why women had less children in an earlier period of American history, right? Um, birth control over time gets more affordable and more reliable. Less religious people have fewer children. And as the country generally becomes less religious overall, birth rates will go down. People living in big urban areas, right? They're very crowded. You're not going to have 7 kids if you live in an apartment in Brooklyn, right? All those factors, if you remember that. Another thing that has to do with family planning and just the state of the family in general is divorce rates. During the 1960s, there's certain things in society that are radically changing. Poverty rate is going down radically. Awesome. Divorce rates are going up radically. States liberalized divorce laws and more women were divorcing. States made it easier to get divorced. The general term that was used was called no fault divorce. Irreconcilable differences, if you've ever heard that term. Historically, marriage was viewed as a contract, and to get a divorce, you need to prove that one of the parties of the contract, one of the spouses, had violated the terms of the contract through the big ones would be abuse, neglect, or abandonment. You would have to prove something in court to get the divorce, right? There was a lot more of a process that you had to go through. And as the states made it easier to get divorced, no fault divorce, you don't need to prove anything, both sides don't even need to agree. It's a lot easier to get a divorce, okay? For better, for worse. And when it got easier, it happened a lot more. And the social stigma around divorce also basically disappeared. It's not a taboo the way it was earlier in our history. So all those things combine to lead to many, many more divorces. Now, is that good? Uh, it increases, making it easier to get a divorce increases the freedom of the adults. It does. It gives them more options. Is it good for children? The social science on this is clear and overwhelming. Divorce, and obviously there are exceptions, but overall, divorce is a disaster for children. It's awful in terms of the social science, predicting bad outcomes for kids when they grow up. Will they drop out of school? Get into abusive relationships, go to prison, whatever it is. Insert bad results here. Divorce is a disaster for kids, statistically speaking. Now, sometimes it's needed for the sake of the kids, right? But generally, it might be good for adults, not good for kids at all, statistically. Okay. Um, the trend here is obvious and extreme, right? Divorce explodes. I want to point out one thing before we move on. If you notice that the divorce rate peaks in like the late 70s and then starts going down, it did. The divorce rate started going down. But today, there are a higher percentage of children in our country living in single parent households. That percentage has never been higher and it continues to increase. So if divorce rates are going down, how could it also be simultaneously the case that there have never been more children in this country living without a father in the house? Because divorce rates are going down, but that doesn't mean families are more stable. Families have never been less stable. So what's that about? Well, you can't get divorced if you never get married in the first place. So the divorce rate dropping does not indicate that, you know, relationships are more stable. It means that the taboo against divorce basically disappeared in the culture, so the rate went way up. And then the taboo against having children outside of marriage or before marriage, that taboo also disappeared. So now we have enormous numbers of American adults who have children who never even got married to begin with. And if you don't get married to begin with, you can't get divorced. So the divorce rate going down does not indicate that families are more stable, if you were curious about that. Um, Vietnam War, President Johnson sends hundreds of thousands of Americans to intervene in the Vietnam War, which at this point had been going on 20 years. It involved France, and there's communists involved, and there's the French are trying to hold on to their empire, and pretty convoluted situation. But as I mentioned briefly in a previous unit, President Kennedy before he died, was secretly planning on pulling all Americans out of Vietnam, but within a little more than a year after his death, we're doing the exact opposite and sending hundreds of thousands of Americans to Vietnam. To give you a quick piece of anecdotal evidence on how destructive this war was, over the course of the war, the United States dropped twice as many bombs on Vietnam as in all of World War II. Vietnam is a tiny, tiny country. World War II was the most destructive war in American history. And the United States dropped twice as many bombs on this tiny country than all of the bombs dropped in all of World War II. So this was not a limited thing, right? This was a catastrophic conflict for all sides, especially obviously the Vietnamese. This led to the largest anti-war movement in American history, led by young people largely who were opposed to the draft. It's a very different period of American history. Now we have an all-volunteer army. Back then there was a draft. And so 18, 19, 20-year-olds, yeah, they had a direct personal stake in this. And the anti-war movement also intersected, you can see Dr. King here with Muhammad Ali, the boxer. It also intersected with the civil rights movement. And there's some documents on this that I uploaded to Canvas if you want to look at that. But Dr. King argued that there was a connection between the war and the civil rights movement in the sense that he had this devastating line in a speech he gave a year before his death, where he talks about seeing white and black young men dying together in Vietnam for a country, for a government that wouldn't really be able to seat them next to each other in a classroom. Pretty brutal, right? Muhammad Ali, the boxer, said similar things, right? Why would I go halfway around the world to kill brown people for a country that treats brown people like dirt? So a lot of people argue that there was a connection between the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement. Women's liberation. We covered an earlier wave of feminism briefly in the course in an earlier unit. The women's liberation movement came to understand that women required more than legal opportunity. The culture that regarded women as nothing more than sexual objects and helpmates to men had to change as well. This reminds me of a similar quote from the textbook from 1 or 2 units ago involving civil rights, when the book said essentially the same thing regarding race. As important as legal equality was, when they were referring to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, how much did it matter if most of the country looked at non-whites as inferior or something to that effect? If you remember that quote, it's basically the same quote. So equal opportunity, yes. Equality under the law, Equal Pay Act that we just covered, right? All good. But just like the civil rights movement, that doesn't change people's minds and hearts, their attitudes. Okay, that takes much longer. So how much progress have we made on this? The culture, according to the author of the textbook 50 years ago, our culture regarded women as nothing more than sexual objects and helpmates to men. So we can kind of divide this. The first thing is how women are portrayed in the culture, and the second thing is basically referring to the helpmate line. It's referring to the role of women in the workplace. The role of women in the workplace has improved radically. Okay. The number of women in, high paying authoritative positions has never been higher. Awesome. The tolerance for sexual harassment in the workplace has never been lower. Awesome. So there's been a lot of progress made in the workplace lane. In the cultural lane, the critique was from the feminist movement at this time that American culture overall regarded women as nothing more than sexual objects. How much progress have we made in that regard? How are we doing there? I don't know. Depends on your point of view. Does our culture still regard women as nothing more than sexual objects? Well, pornography is the biggest single economic driver on the internet. Does our culture in general objectify women? Well, yeah. Cardi B has entered the chat. New terms such as sexism and male chauvinism have become part of the national vocabulary. So there's an awakening here about society's attitudes and specifically men's attitudes towards women. And there was lots of progress in certain lanes, and in other lanes, depends on your point of view. Okay, depends on your point of view. Um, the issue of more kind of family planning, sociological stuff, abortion comes up for the first time in this course, or in the text rather. Many Catholics, for instance, opposed abortion rights and other freedoms sought by women's liberationists. Couple things on this quote that I want you to assess. Many Catholics opposed abortion rights. Well, yeah. Um, are Catholics the only people that oppose abortion? Are devout Muslims big fans of abortion? Are Orthodox Jews big fans of abortion? They're singling out Catholics, but they're doing that, I think, for a reason, which I'll get back to that in a minute. I want you to focus on the wording of this, and you might agree with this, but I want to point something out, okay? The book talks about abortion rights and other freedoms. The book is casually referring to abortion as a right and as a form of freedom. Now, a lot of you may very well agree with that framing. That's fantastic. I do want you to understand that half of the country at least would reject this framing out of hand. The argument against this framing is that abortion is not a form of freedom. Certainly not for the baby, it's not, right? Now, of course, an equal number of people on the other side, on the pro-choice side, would say, no, abortion is one of the most fundamental forms of freedom a woman can have. So think that through, but understand this is another example of how this textbook just casually assumes a certain point of view and a certain bias that does not reflect the country at large. The liberalism of the 60s had made the old Democratic coalition increasingly unworkable. Okay, so that's why they're pointing out the Catholic thing, I think. So we covered earlier in the course, a main pillar of the Democrat Party, there were two, the white supremacists in the South and first, second, third generation immigrants in the northern cities, specifically Irish and Italian immigrants who are overwhelmingly Catholic. And so Irish Catholics, for example, had always voted for Democrats. But when Democrats start embracing abortion and defining it as a form of freedom, a lot of Catholics were just, you know what, I can't vote for these people. What is this? I can't vote for a politician that talks about abortion as a form of freedom. For this reason, a lot of people who had always voted Democrat left the Democrat Party. We referenced this earlier. The narrative, the dominant paradigm narrative on why people stopped voting Democrat is because of race. We covered that briefly earlier. This is an example of there were other reasons. There were other things going on that led people to change how they voted. This might surprise you. This is a recent poll on abortion, pro-choice, pro-life, male, female. The conventional wisdom holds that women are more pro-choice than men. This poll, and there are many others that reach a similar conclusion, might surprise you. Who's more likely to be pro-life? In other words, who's more likely to oppose abortion? Women are more likely to be anti-abortion than men. Does that surprise you? It might surprise you. It might go against your assumptions. It's interesting, right? Why are men more supportive of abortion than women? One theory is that the sexual revolution, which encompassed a whole bunch of stuff, birth control, ending the taboo against premarital and or extramarital sex, ending the taboo about homosexuality, ending the taboo about divorce, um, much more overt sexual content in mainstream culture. All of those things, whether you think they're good or bad or in the middle, all of those things kind of fall under the umbrella of the quote sexual revolution. Well, why would men be more supportive of abortion? One theory is the sexual revolution in our culture in general has been, say, encouraging, certainly not discouraging promiscuous behavior. Okay. And certainly our culture has moved to a point of we don't want to, uh, don't slut shame people, right? Stuff like that. Well, the theory is that men are more supportive of abortion because men love the idea of sex without consequence. And what is the ultimate firewall? What's the ultimate last resort to preserve sex without consequence? Abortion. That's one theory to try to explain this data, right? So it's not quite as obviously you're going to have your own personal opinions on abortion, which is totally appropriate, obviously. But it is important also to understand, even if you disagree with other people's points of view on this, to understand how mixed this data is. All right. The pro-life movement is much more widespread than people might think, and it encompasses groups that might surprise you, right? Women are more pro-life than men. 1968, President Johnson declines to run for re-election, so he could have run again. As you know, there are term limits now on the presidency, and so you can only be elected twice. It does not need to be consecutive, as we learned in 2024. But the limit of how long someone can be president is not 8 years, it's actually 10. And there's a loophole. How do you get to be president for 10 years if you can only run twice? President Johnson uh, became president by virtue of the assassination of President Kennedy. Johnson was the vice president. He finished Kennedy's term about a year and a half. Then he ran again and won and was president for 4 years. Now he's been president for 5.5 years. You with me? He could have run again because if he had won and had another 4 years, he would have been up to 9.5 years. So in a situation like that, that's the loophole. If you become president because the president dies and there's less than 2 years in that term, you can have two full terms on your own. So he could have run and he decided not to. That was unprecedented until 2024. A sitting president basically just given up. I'm not even going to try to get reelected. It's almost unheard of. Robert Kennedy, the brother of the slain president, runs for president. His main focus was ending the Vietnam War, and he, like his brother, was assassinated. So it's a big what if. We obviously don't know if he would have won. Most people tend to think he probably would have. So yet another high profile assassination, right? During the 60s, many, many high profile assassinations. So another tragedy for the Kennedy family. And I do want to point out that there's a lot of people argue that these assassinations, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Bobby Kennedy, that they had to be sort of a part of some big, wide spanning conspiracy, right? There's no evidence of that I'm aware of. But on paper, look, what do they have in common? The Kennedys, Malcolm X, and Dr. King. One thing they had in common was that generally speaking, they were all opposed to the Vietnam War. Isn't that interesting? So you see how someone might come to the conclusion there's some invisible Illuminati group of, puppet masters that are killing high profile American leaders who were opposed to the Vietnam War. There's no evidence that that happened, but on paper, it's clearly a pattern, right? You have to be blind not to see that. 1968, the book says every category of crime was up. Especially disconcerting was the doubling of the murder rate. Yeah, that's disconcerting. I agree, book. In the 60s, the murder rate doubled. So all kinds of radical data in the 60s. Poverty rate way down. Murder rate way up. Abortion rates up. Divorce rates up. Uh, the book says now crime itself preoccupied politicians, the media, and the public. You notice how they put crime in quotes? Like it's some, crime. Um, what is this about? Textbook authors hate Richard Nixon. Fine. They hate him so much that they put crime in scare quotes as if it's not a thing. If it's some conspiracy theory. Crime. The murder rate doubled. That's not just some trivial thing that people are irrationally paranoid about, right? Those quotation marks around the word crime, it just uh, the murder rate doubled. That's thousands of dead Americans. Uh, Maybe maybe those quotation marks are not necessary. Nixon took advantage of rising discontent over, again with the scare quotes, law and order. Did he take advantage? Well, he's a politician. That's what politicians do. They take advantage of problems and they say, hey, vote for me. I can fix the problem. That's what politics is. So, yeah, he took advantage of it. Notice that the textbook is not concerned about the murder rate doubling. They are very, though, offended that Nixon took advantage of that fact. The problem isn't the fact. The problem is that Richard Nixon noticed it. So that's interesting. So Nixon won the election of 1968. 1972. Nixon pulled out all the stops. Using the advantages of incumbency, he's running for re-election. Nixon gave the economy a well-timed lift and proclaimed prematurely a ceasefire in Vietnam. Nixon ultimately did end the Vietnam War. And one more example of the textbook author's transparent hatred for Richard Nixon. He pulled out all the stops. He gave the economy a well-timed lift. Wow, how do you do that? How do you do that? How do you give the economy a well-timed lift? Because if you could wave a magic wand and make the economy better, why wouldn't every single president ever do that? So the book is giving him no credit for his policies. It's like, oh, he gave the economy a lift to trick people into voting for him. He won 49 states. The textbook authors, the historians, they hate this guy. Fine. There's a lot to dislike about Richard Nixon, no doubt. He was, at this time, based on how we measure things in our system, the most popular president in the history of this country. Does that mean he was a good guy? I don't know. That's for you to assess. The voters loved the job he was doing. He won again 49 states. And the textbook authors are desperately looking for a reason for why 98% of our states could have been so stupid because they believed that crime was a problem. They were hoodwinked, apparently, according to the authors. And then, of course, in short order, as we covered briefly in an earlier unit, Nixon completely destroyed himself by, being involved in this ridiculous plot, the Watergate thing, to break into the Democrats' office. And ultimately, he was going to be impeached and removed, and he had to resign the presidency 2 years after winning 49 states. And the ultimate irony, of course, is he destroyed himself without any reason. His people were trying to cheat in an election in which he won 49 states. There was no point. Like the criminality of it aside and the corruption of it aside, there wasn't even any point. You don't need to cheat. And they didn't even get any information. He tried to cheat in an election in which he was winning the biggest landslide in the history of the country. So, uh, incredibly flawed person, of course, to be sure. But you should also understand that in this window of time, he was objectively the most popular president in the history of the country, despite what the textbook says. All right, so that's it. We got 2 units left, and I will see you next time.